Picture this. You walk into a quiet backyard coop, early morning, the smell of feed and damp wood still hanging in the air. Somewhere in there's a bird that could send you to the hospital. Not a hawk, not a wild animal that wandered in. A chicken. One of the most common animals humans have ever raised, and yet, in certain bloodlines, it turned into something closer to a small, feathered weapon. 10,000 years of domestication, and somehow, we ended up with a chicken that attacks first and asks questions never. Doesn't that sound backwards to you? We tamed wolves into golden retrievers. We turned wild boars into pigs that nap in the sun. So why, out of every animal we've gentled down over the centuries, does domestication sometimes go the other direction entirely and produce something more dangerous, not less? Here's the strange part. This isn't just a chicken problem. It happens with foxes. It happens with geese. It happens with pigs that go feral again after only a few generations. Something about the process itself carries a hidden risk, one most people assume domestication automatically erases. And it doesn't. Here's a number worth sitting with for a second. There are more chickens on this planet than any other bird, tens of billions of them, spread across nearly every country on Earth. Out of that entire ocean of birds, most calm, most predictable, certain lineages broke the pattern completely. Now put yourself in the pen with one of these roosters. Your hand reaches toward the feed tray, slow, careful, the way you would with any bird. Before you even register movement, its spurs are already in the air, aimed at your leg. Logically, none of this should exist. Selective breeding tends to favor animals that are easier to manage, easier to live with. Aggression should fade out, the same way it did in dogs, in cattle, in almost every species we brought close to us. And yet, in flock after flock, in region after region, the opposite happened. Documented injuries, fingers, forearms, one case deep enough to need stitches, from an animal. Most people picture pecking harmlessly at corn. But here's what makes this bigger than one strange chicken breed. Once you start looking, this same pattern shows up again, in completely different animals, in completely different corners of the world, almost like domestication has a fault line running underneath it that we rarely talk about. That same rooster, the one still watching your hand near the feed tray, isn't actually alone in this story. And that's really the heart of what's going on here. Geese, kept on farms for centuries, show a strikingly similar pattern: territorial, sudden, coordinated aggression between birds defending the same patch of ground, almost like a feathered cousin of the very bird standing in front of you. Domesticated pigs, when released or escaped into the wild, don't drift back toward the calm barnyard animal we picture either. Within a small number of generations, their offspring grow tusks, thicken their hide, and develop defensive behavior closely resembling their wild boar ancestors. The same reversal hiding underneath the surface of an animal that looks perfectly tame. If you've ever wondered why abandoned farm pigs can become a genuine hazard in the wild within a single decade, this is exactly why. Researchers studying feral pig populations have noted this reversal happens far faster than most people expect, which brings us right back to the bird in front of you. If domestication is supposed to be a one-way street toward gentleness, why does the road seem to run both directions so easily? For that rooster, for these pigs, for animals that share almost nothing except the same hidden rule book. And if this kind of hidden pattern is new to you, it's worth sticking around, because the actual mechanism behind it is even stranger than the examples themselves. So here's the mechanism behind that rooster, and it's simpler than you'd expect, even though it explains a huge amount of what's going on. Not just for him, but for every animal we've touched this way. It comes down to something called genetic linkage, which just means certain traits are physically bundled together on the same stretch of DNA, so selecting for one often drags the other along, whether anyone intends it or not. Farmers selecting for size, strength, or fast growth in that exact bloodline weren't trying to create aggression. Nobody wrote that goal down anywhere, but tied to those same genes, riding along quietly, was often a lower threshold for hostility and a stronger hormonal response tied to dominance. It wasn't cruelty, it wasn't neglect. It wasn't a harsh environment turning a gentle animal mean. That distinction matters because It's the assumption most people reach for first, and it's simply not what the evidence shows. The aggression wasn't punished into these animals by bad treatment. It was quietly packaged in, generation after generation, attached to the very traits that looked like success. Ask yourself this: how many hidden traits do you think are riding along behind the ones we actually choose for? Because that question sits underneath every domesticated species we've ever shaped. And most of the time, nobody notices until the pattern is already locked in. There's one experiment that shows this mechanism with startling clarity, and it goes back to Siberia in 1959, when a Soviet geneticist named Dmitry Belyaev began breeding silver foxes for a single trait only: calmness around humans. Nothing else. Not size, not coat color, not litter number. Purely tameness. Within a small number of generations, something remarkable happened. The tame foxes didn't just behave differently, their bodies changed too. Floppy ears appeared, curled tails, patches of unusual coloring, even shifts in hormone levels. All of it tied to that one original trait through the same kind of genetic bundling described earlier. Belyaev's foxes prove the reverse of the chicken story. Select purely for gentleness, and gentleness spreads, dragging unrelated traits along with it, the same way aggression spread in other lineages when strength was the target instead. Go back to that coop for a second, the one from the very beginning, your hand frozen halfway to the feed tray. That hesitation mirrors exactly what happened with Belyaev's foxes, just running in the opposite direction. Selection doesn't choose a single trait in isolation. It reaches into a tangled genetic package and pulls out far more than anyone intended, for better or worse. If stories like this tend to stick with you later, on a drive somewhere, in the shower, that's usually the sign to hit subscribe, because there's a lot more of this hiding in places you wouldn't expect. And if you've got a guess about which trait you think humans accidentally dragged along in your own pets, drop it in the comments, because the answers people come up with are often more accurate than they'd expect. Now, before this turns into a rule with no exceptions, it's worth being precise, because the pattern doesn't play out identically everywhere, not even for that same rooster's bloodline. First, there are chicken lineages descended from the exact same ancestral stock as the bird from the coop that show almost none of the aggression described earlier, because different breeders in different regions prioritized calmness alongside size, proving the aggressive trait was never mandatory, just common when nobody was actively selecting against it. Second, Belyaev's tame foxes didn't stay isolated in a lab forever. Some lines were later crossed back toward wilder stock, and the calm behavior degraded within a handful of generations, showing that these traits can be lost almost as quickly as they were gained. Third, and this one tends to surprise people the most, feral pigs don't all revert at the same speed. Some populations in colder, harsher climates reverted to wild traits within 3 or 4 generations, while others in milder environments took considerably longer, almost like the environment itself decides how loudly those old genes get to speak again. Think of it the way an old family trait sometimes skips a generation entirely, then reappears sharply in the next one, unpredictable, but never actually gone. That unpredictability is exactly why this pattern slipped past so many breeders and researchers for so long. Nobody could pin it down consistently enough to fully control it on purpose. Here's something behavioral researchers have noticed that rarely makes it into casual conversation. Among farm geese, conflict is statistically far more likely to occur between birds housed with others that look nearly identical to them, compared to birds sharing space with visibly different flock mates. Similarity, not difference, seems to sharpen rivalry, because the birds appear to read close resemblance as direct competition for the exact same role within the group. Doesn't that flip what you'd expect? You'd think shared appearance would create comfort, familiarity, maybe even a kind of ease. Instead, across several domesticated species, it does the opposite. It raises tension rather than lowering it. Some keepers have adjusted flock composition specifically around this fact, deliberately mixing coloring and size, just to reduce conflict, a small, almost invisible decision that changes how peacefully an entire group can actually coexist. And that detail, sameness breeding conflict instead of comfort, quietly ties every one of these stories together. The chickens, the geese, the foxes, the pigs, all of them shaped by the same invisible rulebook running underneath domestication itself. So go back to that co-op one final time. Your hand near the feed tray, the bird watching you the way it's watched every hand that's ever entered that space. What you were sensing wasn't an isolated accident. It was one small example of a much larger truth, that domestication was never a guaranteed path toward gentleness. It was always a gamble, one where humans chose a single visible trait and unknowingly inherited an entire hidden package, riding alongside it, sometimes softness, sometimes hostility, rarely anything in between. Belyaev's foxes prove it can go one way. Certain chicken lines prove it can go the other. Feral pigs prove it can even reverse itself entirely, given enough time and the right conditions. Every one of these stories is really the same discovery, told through different animals, in different corners of the world, decades apart. And that rooster just happened to be the one standing closest to the door when it opened. You rarely get only what you asked for. Something else always comes along for the ride, folded into the same strand of DNA, waiting patiently for the right generation to finally reveal itself. Humans never stopped evolving the animals around them. We simply stopped noticing that we still were, and somewhere in a quiet coop, a backyard, a barn, every domesticated creature we've ever claimed to have tamed is still evolving right beside us, whether we're watching or not. If this kind of hidden pattern, running underneath something as ordinary as farm animals, is the sort of thing that sticks with you, go ahead and subscribe. Drop a like if it changed how you think about domestication. And tell me in the comments, which animal's hidden trait surprised you the most?